The whole porch goes silent when Rhett Boone, a man built like a barn door, sunbeaten and towering in his battered Stetson, leans down toward the trembling girl in white and drawls, "Size isn't everything, is it?" Annie Marlowe grips her dress so tight her knuckles go bone white. The wedding crowd holds its breath. Something dangerous hangs in the dusty air between them, and everyone knows tonight will decide more than just a name. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The September sun bore down on Flat Ridge like divine judgment, turning the wooden planks of the Boone ranch house into a griddle. Annie Marlowe stood at the edge of the porch, watching dust devils spiral across the hardpan yard where her wedding reception was supposed to be taking place. Wedding. The word felt foreign in her mouth, like a language she'd learned but never spoken. She was 22 years old and felt ancient. Behind her, fiddle music sawed through the afternoon heat, punctuated by the stomp of boots and the bright laughter of people who belonged here. People who'd known each other since childhood, who shared history written in the lines of fence posts and the names carved into the old oak by the creek. Annie belonged nowhere, least of all here. Her dress, borrowed from a woman she'd met exactly twice, hung loose at the shoulders and tight at the waist, a constant reminder that she was wearing someone else's life. The lace collar scratched her throat. She wanted to tear it off, to run, to wake up back in her narrow bed in Philadelphia where her sister Maggie's labored breathing had been the soundtrack to her sleepless nights. But there was no going back now. "Mrs. Boone," the voice came from beside her, low and amused. "That's you now, isn't it?" Annie turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Rhett Boone stood there, filling the doorway, blotting out the light. He was even larger up close than he'd seemed at the ceremony, 6'4" if he was an inch, with shoulders that strained the seams of his wedding shirt. His face was all hard angles, weathered dark by years under an unforgiving sky. A scar ran from his left eyebrow into his hairline, white against bronze skin, but it was his eyes that held her, pale blue, almost colorless, like ice over deep water. "Yes," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "That's me." He smiled, or something like it. His mouth curved, but the expression didn't reach those ice-chip eyes. Funny thing, marriage. Two strangers sign a piece of paper and suddenly there's supposed to be something more. I suppose that's one way to look at it. Annie forced herself to meet his gaze, though every instinct screamed at her to look away, to make herself small. She'd learned young that men like Rhett Boone, men who took up too much space, whose voices carried too much weight, expected deference. Her father had been such a man, before the consumption took him. The factory foreman who'd grabbed her wrist and smiled while his hand wandered. The landlord who'd suggested creative payment methods when the rent came due. Annie had learned to bend like grass in the wind, to survive by yielding. But something in her was tired of bending. Rhett stepped closer, and she smelled leather and tobacco and something darker underneath, sweat and dust and the musk of animals. "You scared of me, Annie Marlowe?" He used her maiden name deliberately, she thought, a reminder that she wasn't really his yet, not where it mattered. Should I be? The question came out sharper than she intended. His eyebrows rose. Around them, the party continued, but Annie felt the weight of eyes turning their way. People pretending not to watch while watching intently. This was entertainment, she realized with a cold twist in her gut. The big man and his tiny bride bought and paid for. "Most people are," Rhett said, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite name. Pride? Regret? "I'm not what you'd call a gentleman. I didn't come here expecting gentleness." "No?" He tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "What did you come here expecting?" "Survival," she thought. "Food for my sister. A roof that doesn't leak. A chance." But she said, "A bargain. An agreement between two people who need something from each other." Something flickered in those pale eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or respect. Before he could respond, a crash came from inside the house, followed by raucous laughter. Rhett's jaw tightened. "I should see to the guests," he said, but he didn't move. Instead, he reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted. When she didn't, his fingers brushed the side of her face, calloused and rough. You're not what I expected either." Then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd, and Annie could breathe again. She retreated to the far end of the porch, where the shade from the eaves offered a few degrees of relief from the relentless sun. From here she could see the whole spread, the main house, weathered but solid, the barn with its crooked door, the corrals where horses dozed with their heads hanging low, and beyond it all, the endless expanse of prairie grass rippling like an ocean. So much space, so much emptiness. In Philadelphia, she had been cramped in a two-room tenement with thin walls and thinner hope. Here, the land seemed to swallow sound, to absorb human presence like it was nothing at all. A person could disappear out there and never be found. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, she felt something dangerous stir in her chest, something like possibility. Quite a specimen, isn't he? Annie turned to find a woman watching her, sharp-eyed and knowing. She was perhaps 40, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of face that had been handsome once but had settled into stern lines. She wore a plain brown dress and sensible boots, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who answered to no one. "I'm sorry," Annie said. "Rhett." The woman nodded toward the house, where Annie could hear her new husband's booming laugh rising above the general din. "Big as a mountain and twice as immovable. That's what you're thinking, isn't it?" Annie hesitated. Something about this woman's directness demanded honesty. "Among other things," the woman smiled, and it transformed her face. "I'm Clara Hendricks. I run the general store in town. Also serve as midwife, occasional doctor, and professional busybody." She extended a work-roughened hand. "Pleased to meet you properly, Mrs. Boone." Annie shook her hand, grateful for the firm grip. "Annie? Please, just Annie." "Annie, then." Clara studied her with an intensity that made Annie feel like a book being read. "You came from Philadelphia?" "Yes." "On purpose?" Despite herself, Annie felt a smile tug at her lips. "More or less." Clara pulled a fan from her pocket and waved it languidly, stirring the heavy air. "I'll be direct, since that's my nature. This town loves its gossip like a drunk loves whiskey, and you're the freshest news we've had since old man Peterson's mule kicked him into next Tuesday. So I'm going to ask you plain, are you all right?" The question, simple and genuine, hit Annie harder than she expected. When was the last time anyone had asked her that? When was the last time anyone had cared about the answer? "I don't know yet," she said honestly. Clara nodded as if this was the exact right answer. "Fair enough. Here's what you need to know about Rhett Boone, since I doubt anyone else will tell you straight." She leaned against the porch rail, her voice dropping. "His daddy was mean. The kind of mean that gets into a man's bones and twists everything. Beat Rhett and his mama both until Rhett got big enough to hit back. The old man died 10 years ago, fell off his horse drunk, or so they say." Annie's throat tightened. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what everyone knows but nobody says. Rhett was 17 when his daddy died. 17 and already bigger than most grown men, with a temper to match. His mama passed 2 years later. Grief, they said, though I think it was relief that killed her. Sometimes surviving is harder than suffering." The fiddle music shifted to something slower, melancholy. Annie watched a group of children chase each other around the yard, their shrieks of joy piercing the heavy afternoon. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Clara's gaze was steady. "Because you need to know what you've walked into. Rhett Boone is a complicated man. He's got his daddy's size and his daddy's temper, but he's not his daddy. Not entirely. I've seen him gentle a wild horse with patience that would surprise you. I've also seen him break a man's jaw for cheating at cards." "That's not particularly reassuring." "It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be true." Clara touched Annie's arm, a brief gesture of solidarity. "You've got backbone, I can see that. You're going to need it. But you've also got something else. You've got leverage." "Leverage? He needs you. Why else would he send for a mail-order bride? A man like Rhett could have his pick of local girls, or at least he could if he wasn't so damn difficult. No, he needs you for some reason, which means you're not as powerless as you think." Before Annie could respond, a commotion erupted inside the house. Raised voices, the sound of something breaking. Clara sighed. "That'll be Tommy Reeves. Boy can't hold his liquor worth a damn." She straightened. If you need anything, and I mean anything, you come find me in town. The store's on Main Street, can't miss it. And Annie?" She paused. "Don't let them make you small. You're already small enough in body. Don't let them shrink your spirit too." Then she was gone, leaving Annie alone with those words echoing in her head. Don't let them make you small. The party spilled back outside, bringing Rhett with it. He'd removed his jacket, and his shirt clung to his chest, dark with sweat. He was laughing at something, head thrown back, and for a moment he looked younger, almost carefree. Then his eyes found Annie, and the laughter died. He crossed the yard in long strides, scattering children like chickens. When he reached her, he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stared out at the horizon, his jaw working like he was chewing over words he couldn't quite spit out. "We should talk," he said finally. "About arrangements." Annie's stomach clenched. She'd known this was coming, had been bracing for it since she stepped off the train 3 days ago and saw him waiting on the platform like judgment itself, but knowing didn't make it easier. "All right," she said. He glanced back at the party, at the faces watching them with barely concealed curiosity. "Not here. Come on." He led her away from the house, past the barn, and toward a small creek that cut through the property. The water was low, more mud than flow, but cottonwood trees grew along its banks, offering shade and privacy. Grasshoppers exploded from the grass with each step, and the air smelled of dust and wild sage. When they were out of earshot, Rhett stopped. He still wouldn't look at her directly, just stood there with his hands on his hips, staring at the water like it might offer answers. "I'm not good with words," he said abruptly. "Never have been. I'm better with my hands, with action. But I reckon I owe you honesty, at least. I'd appreciate that." Annie's heart hammered, but she kept her voice level. "I sent for you because I need a wife. Not for the reasons you might think." He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "This ranch, it's all I got. It's all I am. But I can't run it alone, not anymore. I need help. Someone to manage the house, to handle the books, to—" He gestured vaguely. "To be a partner, I guess." "A partner," Annie repeated carefully. "Not a possession." His eyes snapped to hers, sharp and assessing. "You read the advertisement?" "Every word." "Then you know what I offered. Room and board, a share in the ranch's profits, protection. In exchange for domestic labor and companionship." Annie pulled the folded paper from inside her sleeve, where she'd kept it like a talisman. "I read it very carefully, Mr. Boone. I also added some terms of my own." His eyebrows rose. "Did you now?" "I did." She unfolded the paper. Not the advertisement, but a separate document she'd written in her careful, cramped hand during the train ride west. "I had Mr. Peterson witness it. He's a notary, I believe." "He is." Rhett took the paper, his expression unreadable. His lips moved slightly as he read, and Annie watched his face for any sign of anger. Instead, he looked impressed. "You want to keep your name," he read aloud. "Annie Marlowe Boone, not Mrs. Rhett Boone. You want a monthly allowance, separate from household funds. You want—" He paused, a smile tugging at his mouth. "You want deed to the old Miller property in town?" "My aunt's shop," Annie said, lifting her chin. "She left it to me when she died. It's been boarded up for 5 years, but it's mine. I want it written down that it stays mine, separate property, no matter what happens to this marriage." "And if I say no?" Annie's hands trembled, but she laced her fingers together and held his gaze. "Then we're not partners. We're employer and employee at best, master and servant at worst. And I didn't come all this way to be anyone's servant." The silence stretched between them, taut as a rope. Somewhere a crow called, harsh and mocking. The sun beat down, and Annie felt sweat trickle down her spine, making the borrowed dress stick to her skin. Then Rhett laughed. A real laugh this time, surprised and genuine. "You got fire in you," he said, shaking his head. "I'll be damned. You come here looking like you might blow away in a strong wind, but you got steel underneath. Is that a yes?" He handed the paper back to her, his fingers brushing hers. "It's a yes, on one condition." Annie's stomach dropped. "What condition?" "You give this marriage a real try. Not just going through the motions, but actually trying. I'm not asking for love. I'm not fool enough to expect that. But I'm asking for respect, for honesty, for, he struggled for the word, for a real partnership, like you said. Annie studied his face, looking for the trap, the catch. But all she saw was a man who looked as uncertain as she felt, standing in the shade of cottonwood trees, asking for something he didn't quite know how to name. I can do that, she said quietly. If you can do the same. Deal. He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His grip was firm but careful, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile. Partners, then. Partners, she agreed. They walked back to the house in silence, but it was a different silence now. Less hostile, more uncertain, like two people learning a new dance, not sure of the steps but willing to try. The party was in full swing when they returned. Someone had brought out a fiddle and a banjo, and couples were dancing in the yard, kicking up dust that glowed golden in the late afternoon light. Annie hung back, but Rhett surprised her by offering his arm. Might as well give them a show, he said with a crooked smile. She let him lead her into the makeshift dance floor, acutely aware of every eye on them. His hand settled on her waist, huge and warm and surprisingly gentle. Her hand disappeared into his, and she had to crane her neck to look up at him. I should warn you, she said. I'm not much of a dancer. Neither am I. Guess we'll stumble through it together. And they did. Rhett moved with surprising grace for such a large man, though he clearly hadn't danced in years. He stepped on her foot twice, apologized both times, and Annie found herself laughing despite everything. Around them, the crowd clapped and whooped, and for a moment, just a moment, she felt like maybe this could work. Then the music stopped, and Tom Reeves stumbled forward, red-faced and drunk. Speech, he called. The groom needs to give a speech. Others took up the cry, and Rhett's face darkened. I already spoke at the ceremony. That was church talk, Tom slurred. We want real talk now. Tell us about your pretty little bride. He leered at Annie. Tell us if good things come in small packages. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Annie felt her face flame, but she kept her expression neutral. This was a test, she realized. Not just of Rhett, but of her. Of them. Rhett's hand tightened on her waist, and for a moment she thought he might do something violent. She could feel the tension in his body, coiled and dangerous. Then he released her and stepped forward, his face carefully blank. You want a speech? He said, his voice carrying across the yard. Fine. I'll give you one. He turned, and his gaze swept over the assembled crowd. Neighbors and strangers, friends and enemies, people who'd known him his whole life and people who'd come just for the spectacle. Most of you know me, he said. Know my family, know my history. Know that I'm not the kind of man who does things halfway. When I work hard. When I fight to win. And when I marry, he paused, his eyes finding Annie. When I marry, I mean it. Someone whistled, and there were a few scattered cheers. Annie Marlowe came here from Philadelphia. She didn't know me from Adam, but she came anyway, because she's got courage most of us can't even imagine. She left everything she knew, everyone she loved, and got on a train to a place she'd never seen to marry a man she'd never met. Annie's throat tightened. This wasn't what she'd expected. Now, some of you might look at her and think she's small, delicate, easy to push around. Rhett's voice hardened. You'd be wrong, because it takes a hell of a lot of strength to do what she did. More strength than most of you will ever need. He held out his hand, and after a moment, Annie took it. He pulled her close, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, meant just for her but carrying to the crowd anyway. Size isn't everything, is it? He said, and there was something in his eyes she couldn't quite read. Sometimes the smallest people have the biggest hearts. The quietest voices say the most important things. And sometimes, he paused. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show up and stand your ground, even when you're shaking. Annie's eyes stung with unexpected tears. She swallowed hard, refusing to let them fall. So here's my speech, Rhett said, turning back to the crowd. Annie Boone is my wife, my partner, and anyone who disrespects her disrespects me. Are we clear? The silence was absolute. Then Clara Hendricks started clapping, slow and deliberate, and others joined in until the whole yard rang with applause. Tom Reeves, still drunk but slightly more sober in spirit, raised his glass. "To the Boones! To the Boones!" the crowd echoed, and Annie felt the weight of those words settle over her like a cloak, protective and suffocating all at once. The party continued late into the evening, but Annie felt herself fading as the sun sank toward the horizon. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day was wearing off, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Her feet ached in the borrowed shoes, her head pounded from the heat, and the stays of her dress dug into her ribs with every breath. She slipped away when no one was looking, retreating into the house. It was cooler inside, though not by much. The main room was spacious but sparsely furnished. A few rough-hewn chairs, a table that had seen better days, a stone fireplace blackened with use. Doors led off to what she assumed were bedrooms, but she didn't dare explore. Instead, she found a quiet corner and sank onto a bench, letting her head fall back against the wall. Through the window, she could see the party continuing without her. Rhett stood in the center of it all, a giant among ordinary men, laughing at something someone said. He'd defended her, publicly, completely. She didn't know what to do with that. "You all right?" Annie's eyes snapped open. Rhett stood in the doorway, backlit by the setting sun, his expression concerned. "Just tired," she said. He nodded slowly. "It's been a long day. If you want to rest, the bedroom is—" He gestured awkwardly to the left. "It's through there. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, give you time to adjust." Something in Annie's chest eased. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." He stepped into the room, suddenly seeming too large for the space. "We still have to figure out how to live together, how to make this work, but—" He paused. "But I meant what I said out there, about being partners, about respecting you." "I know." And surprisingly, she did. Rhett Boone might be rough and hard and frightening, but she was beginning to suspect he was also honest. In a world full of pretty lies, there was something almost comforting about his brutal directness. "Good." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Annie, that paper you wrote, the one with your terms?" "Yes?" "Keep it safe. And in the morning we'll go into town and have it properly witnessed and filed. I want everything legal, everything clear, no room for misunderstandings." She stared at him, this mountain of a man who held her future in his calloused hands. "Why?" "Because you were right. Partners need trust, and trust needs foundations." He smiled slightly. "Besides, I got a feeling you're going to be good for this place. Good for me. And I don't want to mess that up by being a fool." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and Annie was alone. She sat there for a long time, listening to the party wind down, watching darkness creep across the land like a living thing. Through the window, stars began to appear. More stars than she'd ever seen in Philadelphia, where smoke and light drowned out the sky. Finally, she rose and found the bedroom. It was small but clean, with a bed that looked handmade, a washstand, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. Her trunk, the one she'd brought from Philadelphia, containing everything she owned. She changed out of the wedding dress carefully, folding it despite knowing she'd never wear it again. Beneath it, she wore a simple cotton shift. She took down her hair, brushing out the pins and ribbons until it fell around her shoulders. In the small mirror above the washstand, a stranger looked back at her. Same brown eyes, same serious mouth, but something had shifted. She looked older, maybe, or just different. "Mrs. Annie Marlowe Boone," she whispered to her reflection, testing the name. It felt strange, like a coat that didn't quite fit, but she'd wear it. She'd make it fit. Because this was her choice, her gamble, and Annie Marlowe had not come all this way, had not left her dying sister in the care of neighbors, had not boarded a train into the unknown, had not married a stranger under the brutal western sun, just to give up now. She climbed into the bed, which was softer than she expected, and pulled the quilt up to her chin. Outside, the last of the party guests said their goodbyes. She heard wagons rumbling away, voices fading into the distance. Then silence. Pure, absolute silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through grass and the distant cry of a coyote. Annie closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't quiet. She kept replaying the day. Rhett's face when she'd shown him her terms, Clara's warning, the feel of his hand on her waist during the dance, the way he defended her to the crowd. Size isn't everything, is it? The question lingered in the darkness, unanswered and unanswerable. But somewhere between waking and sleeping, Annie decided something. She decided that Rhett Boone was right. Size wasn't everything. Courage came in all forms. Strength wasn't just physical. And if she could survive Philadelphia, if she could watch her father waste away, nurse her sister through endless nights, work her fingers raw in the textile mill, and still have the courage to board a train west, then she could survive this too. She could survive Rhett Boone. She could survive the vast emptiness of the prairie, the heat and dust and loneliness. She could survive being small in a land that seemed designed to swallow people whole. She could survive, and maybe, just maybe, she could even thrive. Outside in the barn, Rhett lay awake in the hayloft, staring at the rafters. His wedding ring felt strange on his finger, unfamiliar and heavy. He'd never worn jewelry before, had never wanted to, but Annie had asked for wedding rings. It was in her list of terms buried between the practical requests for money and property. Wedding rings, she'd written. Matching, if possible. Such a small thing, really, but somehow it had touched something in him he'd thought long dead. He twisted the ring, listening to the horses shift and breathe in the stalls below. This was his place, his kingdom. He'd built it from nothing after his father died, turned a failing ranch into something profitable through sheer stubbornness and hard work. He'd done it alone, because that was safer, because letting people close meant giving them power to hurt you, and Rhett had been hurt enough for one lifetime. But now there was Annie, small, fragile Annie with her list of demands, and her steady gaze that somehow made him feel like maybe he wasn't as monstrous as he feared. He thought about tomorrow, about taking her into town, about facing the curious stares and whispered comments, about teaching her the ranch, showing her the land, learning how to share a life with someone. It terrified him more than any wild horse, any bar fight, any storm. But it also filled him with something he hadn't felt in years, something dangerous and forbidden and completely unwelcome. Hope. Rhett Boone closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but hope kept him awake long into the night, burning in his chest like a coal he couldn't quite extinguish. Morning came too early, announced by a rooster's crow that cut through Annie's dreams like a knife. She woke disoriented, her heart racing, unsure for a moment where she was. Then memory flooded back, the wedding, the party, Rhett's promise to sleep in the barn, and she sat up, pushing tangled hair from her face. Sunlight streamed through the single window, harsh and unforgiving. The air already felt warm, promising another scorcher of a day. Annie rose stiffly, every muscle protesting yesterday's tension, and went to the washstand. The water in the pitcher was tepid but clean, and she splashed her face, trying to wash away the grit of exhaustion. She dressed quickly in one of her own dresses, plain brown cotton, practical, and anonymous. As she pinned her hair up, she heard movement from the main room, the scrape of a chair, the clink of metal on metal. Rhett was awake. Annie took a breath, steadying herself, and opened the bedroom door. He stood at the stove, his back to her, doing something that produced a sizzling sound and the smell of bacon. He'd changed clothes too, worn denim pants and a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms thick with muscle and rope burned from years of ranch work. His hair was damp, slicked back, and she realized he must have washed at the pump outside. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's on the table. Should still be hot." Annie crossed to the table, where a battered tin cup steamed gently. She wrapped her hands around it, grateful for the warmth despite the building heat. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but she drank it anyway. "I'm not much of a cook," Rhett continued, still focused on the stove. "But I can manage breakfast without burning the place down, usually." "I can cook," Annie said. "That was part of the arrangement, wasn't it? Managing the house?" He turned then, a spatula in one hand, and gave her an appraising look. "Is that what you want to do this morning? Start working?" "What else would I do?" "I don't know. Rest, maybe? Adjust? You just got married yesterday, in case you forgot." "I haven't forgotten." Annie sipped her coffee, meeting his eyes over the rim of the cup. "But I'm not the type to sit idle. If I'm going to be here, I might as well make myself useful." Something flickered in his expression. Approval, maybe, or relief. "Fair enough. But you're eating first. Can't have you fainting in the heat." He dished out eggs and bacon onto 2 tin plates, nothing fancy but generous portions. They ate in silence, The only sounds the scrape of forks and the tick of a clock on the mantel that Annie hadn't noticed the night before. It showed 7:30, which meant she'd slept later than usual. In Philadelphia, she'd been up by 5 every morning, getting ready for the mill. "We'll go into town after breakfast," Rhett said, sopping up egg yolk with a piece of bread. "Get your papers filed, like I promised. Then I'll show you around town properly. Introduce you to people." Annie's stomach tightened. "Is that necessary? The introductions, I mean? You're going to be living here. People are going to talk whether we introduce you proper or not. Might as well control the narrative." He paused. "Besides, you'll need to know who to trust. And who not to trust." His smile was grim. "That too." They finished eating, and Annie washed the dishes while Rhett disappeared outside. She heard him moving around, his boots heavy on the porch, the creak of the barn door. Through the window, she watched him hitch 2 horses to a wagon, a sturdy bay, and a gray mare that looked like she'd seen better days. The house felt different in daylight, less ominous, but no less foreign. Annie moved through the rooms slowly, taking inventory. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all in one. A door to the left led to the bedroom she'd slept in. Another door, which she carefully opened, revealed a smaller room that had clearly been Rhett's. Narrow bed, a chair, clothes hanging from pegs on the wall. Everything spare and utilitarian, nothing soft or decorative. A third door led to what might have once been a study or office. It was full of papers now, stacked haphazardly on every surface. Ledgers, receipts, correspondence. Annie's fingers itched to organize it, to bring order to the chaos. Here was something she could do, something concrete. "Ready?" She turned to find Rhett in the doorway, hat in hand. He looked uncomfortable in his own house, like a guest who didn't quite belong. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." The ride into Flat Ridge took 20 minutes, following a rutted track that cut through the prairie. Annie sat beside Rhett on the wagon bench, acutely aware of his size, the way his shoulder nearly touched hers despite the space between them. He drove with practiced ease, the reins loose in his hands, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. "Looking for something?" Annie asked. "Always looking, coyotes mostly. Had one get into the chicken coop last month. Lost 6 birds before I caught the bastard." He glanced at her. "Sorry, my language gets rough sometimes." "I've heard worse." And she had. The mill had been full of rough language, men and women both pushed to their limits by heat and exhaustion and the constant pressure to produce more, work faster, accept less. "Still, I'll try to watch it around you." Annie almost laughed. Here was this giant of a man, scarred and weather-beaten, apologizing for cursing. It was such an incongruous gesture that she didn't quite know what to make of it. Flat Ridge appeared gradually, materializing out of the heat shimmer like a mirage. It was smaller than Annie had imagined. One main street, perhaps a dozen buildings, and a scattering of houses beyond. The church where they'd been married yesterday stood at the far end, its white paint peeling in the sun. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop with smoke rising from its chimney. And there, on a side street, a small building with boarded windows and a faded sign that read, "Miller's Dress Shop." Annie's breath caught. Her aunt's place. Her place now, according to the terms she'd negotiated. Rhett must have noticed her reaction because he said, "Want to stop there first, before we deal with the legal papers?" "Could we?" He turned the wagon without another word, guiding the horses down the side street. Up close, the shop looked even worse. The boards were warped and splitting, the door hung crooked on its hinges, and weeds grew up through cracks in the wooden steps. But the structure itself seemed sound, the roof intact, the windows unbroken behind their protective boards. "It's not much," Rhett said as Annie climbed down from the wagon. "But the bones are good. Your aunt did good work here before she took sick." "You knew her?" "Everyone knew Sarah Miller. She was the only dressmaker for 50 miles. Made my mama's wedding dress, long time ago." His voice went quiet. "Made her burial dress, too." Annie approached the door, running her fingers over the weathered wood. Inside, dust motes danced in the thin light that leaked through gaps in the boards. She could make out shapes, a counter, shelves, what might have been a dress form standing sentinel in the corner. "I want to restore it," she said suddenly. The words came from somewhere deep, surprising even her. "I want to open it again." "You know dressmaking?" "Some. My aunt taught me before she moved west, and I worked in a textile mill for 3 years. I know fabric, know how to handle a needle. She turned to face him. Would that be acceptable? As part of our arrangement? Rhett leaned against the wagon, studying her. You want to run a business while managing the house? I want to have something of my own, something that's mine, not just borrowed or shared. Annie lifted her chin. You said we were partners. Partners have their own interests, don't they? A slow smile spread across his face. I suppose they do. All right then. You restore the shop, run it if you want, but... He held up a finger. But you do it smart. Get help when you need it, don't work yourself to death, and keep the books clean. I won't have people saying I let my wife run a failing business. It won't fail, Annie said with more confidence than she felt. I'll make sure of it. They left the shop and headed to the office of James Peterson, the notary who'd witnessed their wedding. He was a thin man with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose, and he greeted them with professional courtesy that didn't quite hide his curiosity. Mr. and Mrs. Boone, I expected you might come by. He gestured to chairs in his cramped office. What can I do for you? Rhett nodded to Annie, who produced her carefully written document. We need this witnessed, notarized, and filed with the county. It's a supplement to our marriage agreement. Peterson read through it slowly, his eyebrows rising with each line. When he finished, he looked at Rhett with something like amazement. You agreed to all this? I did. Including the separate property clause? Mr. Boone, do you understand that this means... I understand fine. Rhett's voice carried an edge. My wife wants protection. She wants security. I'm giving it to her. That a problem? Peterson blinked. No problem at all. Just unusual, that's all. Most men wouldn't... I'm not most men, Rhett said flatly. Are you going to file it or not? Of course. Peterson scurried to his desk, pulling out stamps and forms. I'll need both your signatures here, and... He paused. Mrs. Boone, I must ask. Are you signing this of your own free will? No coercion or... None, Annie said clearly. This is my choice, Mr. Peterson. He nodded, satisfied, and they spent the next 20 minutes going through the tedious process of making everything legal. When it was done, Peterson handed Annie a stamped copy of the document. Keep this safe, he said. And Mrs. Boone? I think you're a very wise woman. They emerged back into the sunlight, and Annie felt lighter somehow, as if she'd been carrying a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged. The paper in her pocket represented more than legal protection. It represented possibility. Now, Rhett said, let's go see Clara. She'll want to say hello, and honestly, I could use some tobacco. Ran out last week. The general store was the largest building on Main Street, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and windows displaying everything from bolts of fabric to farming tools. A bell jangled as they entered, and the smell of coffee, leather, and sawdust enveloped them. Clara Hendricks stood behind the counter, helping an older woman with a selection of thread. When she saw them, her face brightened. Well, the newlyweds, gracing us with their presence? She finished with her customer and turned her full attention to Annie. How are you holding up, dear? Well enough, Annie said. That's what they all say at first. Clara's eyes twinkled. Give it a week. Then we'll see. Rhett wandered off to examine the tobacco selection, leaving the women alone. Clara leaned forward, lowering her voice. He treating you right? Yes. Better than I expected, honestly. Good. Because if he wasn't, you'd tell me, wouldn't you? And I'd take my rolling pin to his thick skull. Despite herself, Annie smiled. I believe you would. Damn right I would. Now. Clara straightened. What can I get you? Need anything for the house? Personal items? Annie hesitated. She had so little money of her own, and pride warred with practicality. But Clara seemed to sense her discomfort. Tell you what, Clara said. Let me put together a starter package for you. Basics every woman needs. Soap, needles, thread, that sort of thing. Call it a wedding gift. And before you protest, she added, as Annie opened her mouth, it's already decided. Besides, I'll make Rhett pay for his tobacco, so it'll even out. Rhett returned with a pouch of tobacco and some rolling papers. Clara's robbing me blind, as usual. It's called fair pricing, you oversized ox. Now pay up. They bickered good-naturedly while Annie watched, fascinated by the easy rapport between them. This was how neighbors were supposed to interact, she realized. Not with the suspicious hostility of Philadelphia tenements, where everyone guarded their resources and privacy like dragons hoarding gold. As Clara wrapped Annie's wedding gift in brown paper, the bell jangled again. A woman entered, younger than Clara, perhaps 30, with blonde hair and a dress that was too fine for a Thursday morning in Flat Ridge. She saw Rhett, and her face lit up. "Rhett Boone! I heard you got married, but I didn't believe it until just now." Rhett's expression shuddered. "Catherine, how's the ranch?" "Oh, you know, same as always." Catherine's eyes slid to Annie, assessing and dismissing in one swift glance. "Is this her? The mail-order bride?" The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Annie felt her face heat, but she kept her expression neutral. "This is my wife, Annie," Rhett said, his voice cold. "Annie, this is Catherine Walsh. Her family owns the ranch north of ours." Catherine extended a hand, limp and perfunctory. "Charmed, I'm sure. Tell me, Annie, what possessed you to answer one of those desperate advertisements? Couldn't find a man back east?" "Catherine," Clara said sharply, "mind your manners." "What? I'm just curious. I mean, Rhett could have married anyone." Catherine's smile was poisonous. "Anyone local, I mean. Someone who knows the land, understands the life. Instead, he imports some city girl who probably can't tell a cow from a horse." Annie felt Rhett tense beside her, but before he could speak, she found her voice. "You're right," she said calmly. "I don't know much about ranching. I'm from Philadelphia, where we have indoor plumbing and don't have to walk half a mile to fetch water. But I'm a quick learner, Miss Walsh, and unlike some people, I know when I'm not wanted and can take a hint." Catherine's smile faltered. "It's Mrs. Walsh, actually. I'm a widow." "My condolences," Annie said, her tone making it clear she meant nothing of the sort. Clara made a choking sound that might have been laughter. Rhett's hand found Annie's elbow, gentle but firm. "We should go," he said. "Still got a lot to do today." They left with Clara's package and Rhett's tobacco, stepping back into the bright morning. Annie's heart hammered, adrenaline making her hands shake. She'd never spoken to anyone like that before, never let her anger show so nakedly. Rhett was silent until they reached the wagon. Then he turned to her, and to her surprise, he was grinning. "That was something," he said. "Did you see her face? I don't think anyone's ever talked back to Catherine Walsh in her entire life." "I probably shouldn't have." "No, you absolutely should have. She was being cruel, testing you, wanted to see if you'd cry or run or crumble." He helped her up onto the wagon seat. "Instead, you stood your ground. I'm impressed." "She seemed to know you well." Rhett's grin faded. "We grew up together. Her family and mine, our land borders each other. People thought—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter what people thought. She married Tom Walsh, and he died 2 years ago, kicked by a horse. And now? And now she runs her ranch and occasionally makes everyone around her miserable. Catherine's not a bad person exactly. She's just bitter." He picked up the reins. "But she had no right to speak to you like that. If it happens again, you let me know." They drove in silence for a while, leaving town behind. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, and Annie tried to imagine making a life here, among these vast spaces and these complicated people with their tangled histories. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Sure." "Why didn't you marry Catherine? If everyone expected it, if your families were close?" Rhett was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Because Catherine wanted to marry my ranch, not me. She wanted the land combined with hers, wanted to create some kind of empire. And I wanted—" He paused. "I wanted someone who chose me for me, not for what I owned or what I could give her." "Is that why you sent for a mail-order bride, because someone from far away would have no ulterior motives?" "Partly. Also because every woman in this town has known me since I was a kid. They remember my father, remember what he was like, and they look at me and wonder how much of him is in me." His hands tightened on the reins. "I wanted someone who could see me fresh, without all that history weighing it down." Annie absorbed this, understanding more than he probably meant to reveal. "What was he like, your father?" "Mean, cruel, drunk most of the time, violent all the time." The words came flat and factual. He hated that he was stuck here, hated that his dreams of wealth never came true, and he took it out on everyone around him, especially my mother. Did he hit you? Until I got big enough to hit back. Then he mostly left me alone, focused on my mother instead. Rhett's jaw clenched. I tried to stop him. God knows I tried, but I was just a kid and he was so much bigger than me back then. Clara said he died when you were 17. He did. Fell off his horse drunk, cracked his skull open on a rock. They ruled it an accident. He glanced at her. You wondering if I killed him? The blunt question startled her. Did you? No, but I would have, eventually. I'd thought about it enough times, planned it in my head, how I'd do it, how I'd make it look like an accident. He said it without emotion, like he was discussing the weather. But the whiskey got him first, saved me from becoming him, I guess. Annie didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They rode on, the sun climbing higher, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. When they reached the ranch, Rhett stopped the wagon at the house. You go inside, get out of the heat. I need to check on the stock, make sure nothing happened while we were gone. But Annie shook her head. Show me. I want to see everything. Learn how it all works. He looked at her, surprised. It's hot, Annie, and dusty. Not exactly pleasant. I didn't come here for pleasant. I came here for partnership, remember? Partners understand each other's work. That smile again, crooked and genuine. All right then. But don't say I didn't warn you. He drove the wagon to the barn, and they spent the next hour walking the property. Rhett showed her the corrals where he kept the horses, explaining bloodlines and temperaments with the kind of detail that spoke of real love for the animals. He showed her the cattle grazing in distant pastures, the irrigation system he'd built to keep his small vegetable garden alive, the shed where he stored feed and equipment. Annie asked questions, lots of them, and Rhett answered patiently. What did the horses eat? How often did the cattle need to be moved? Where did their water come from? How many acres did he own? 400, he said. Not huge by some standards, but enough. My father nearly lost it all through bad decisions and worse habits. I spent the last 10 years buying back parcels he'd sold off piece by piece. That's why you need help, Annie said, understanding. You've been doing the work of 3 men. Something like that. He wiped sweat from his forehead. I hired hands seasonally for branding and roundup, but day to day, it's just been me. Which is fine for the animals, but the business side, he gestured vaguely. I'm not good with numbers, with paperwork. Things pile up. Annie thought of the chaotic office, the stacks of unsorted papers. I could help with that. I'm good with numbers. Yeah? I kept books for the mill supervisor sometimes. Tracked production, calculated wages. It's not that different from ranch accounts, I imagine. Rhett looked at her like he was seeing her anew. You're full of surprises, aren't you? I could say the same about you. They walked back to the house as the sun reached its zenith, the heat becoming truly oppressive. Annie's dress stuck to her back, and her hair had come loose from its pins, curling damply around her face. She must look a mess, but Rhett didn't seem to notice or care. Inside, the house offered marginal relief. Rhett pumped water from the kitchen sink, a luxury Annie hadn't fully appreciated until now, and they both drank deeply. I should make lunch, Annie said. Or we could make it together, Rhett suggested, since we're partners and all. So they did, working side by side in the small kitchen. It was awkward at first. They kept getting in each other's way, reaching for the same things, uncertain of the rhythm. But gradually they found a pattern, and Annie discovered that Rhett wasn't entirely hopeless in the kitchen. He could slice bread without mangling it and knew how to fry potatoes without burning them. They ate at the table, simple food but satisfying. And for the first time since arriving, Annie felt something almost like contentment. Not happiness, exactly. That seemed too large, too premature. But a sense that maybe, possibly, this could work. This afternoon, Rhett said, I need to ride out to the north pasture, check the fencing. You want to come, or would you rather stay here? Annie thought about it. Every instinct said to go, to learn, to prove she could handle the physical demands. But exhaustion was catching up with her, and the thought of hours in the saddle under the brutal sun made her want to weep. I should stay, she admitted. Start going through those papers in the office, make some sense of them. If Rhett was disappointed, he didn't show it. That'd be helpful, actually. I've been putting it off for months, years maybe. I noticed. He laughed at that, a real laugh that transformed his face. You're not afraid to be honest, are you? Would you prefer I lie? God, no. I get enough of that from everyone else. He stood, stretching. All right. I'll be back before dark. There's food in the pantry if you get hungry, and the pump's right outside if you need more water. And Annie? He paused. Don't overdo it. The papers will still be there tomorrow. Then he was gone, leaving Annie alone in the house. She sat for a moment, listening to the silence. It was different from city silence, which was never truly silent. Always the rumble of machinery, the shout of neighbors, the clatter of cartwheels on cobblestones. Here, silence meant space, meant distance from other human lives. It should have been lonely. Instead, Annie found it almost peaceful. She cleared the lunch dishes, washed them methodically, then went to tackle the office. The room was even worse up close, paper spilling from every surface, ledgers with incomplete entries, receipts dating back years. Some were water damaged, others chewed by mice. It was a disaster. Annie rolled up her sleeves and began. She started by sorting, one pile for receipts, one for correspondence, one for ledgers, one for things she couldn't immediately identify. The work was tedious and dusty, and within an hour she was sneezing constantly. But there was satisfaction in it too, in bringing order to chaos. As she worked, she began to piece together the story of the ranch. Rhett had been telling the truth. His father had nearly destroyed the place. The ledgers from 10 years ago showed debt after debt, land sales, equipment repossessed. But then, after the old man's death, the trajectory changed. Slowly, painfully, Rhett had clawed his way back. Small payments on massive debts. Land bought back, acre by acre. New equipment purchased, used, but maintained carefully. He'd done it all alone with no formal education that Annie could see, just stubborn determination and backbreaking work. She found receipts for his mother's funeral. The coffin had cost more than 3 months' worth of ranch income. There was a notation in the margin, in Rhett's rough handwriting, Mama deserved better. Annie's throat tightened. She set that receipt aside carefully, feeling like she'd intruded on something private. Hours passed. The light shifted, afternoon bleeding into evening. Annie's back ached from bending over papers, and her fingers were gray with dust. But she'd made real progress. 3 piles of sorted documents, a list of questions for Rhett, and a sense of the ranch's financial situation. It wasn't terrible, actually. The debts were nearly paid off. Income from cattle sales had been steady the last 3 years. With proper management, the ranch could not just survive, but thrive. She was writing notes when she heard hoofbeats outside, then Rhett's heavy tread on the porch. He appeared in the office doorway, dusty and tired, and stopped short when he saw what she'd accomplished. Jesus, he said, you did all this? It's not finished, but it's a start. Annie gestured to her piles. Your filing system needed work. My filing system was throw it on a surface and hope for the best. He stepped into the room, looking around with something like wonder. I can see the desk. I haven't seen the desk in 2 years. That's appalling. That's my life. He picked up one of the ledgers, flipping through her neat annotations. You understood all this? Most of it. Some entries don't make sense, and you're missing a lot of receipts, but the overall picture is clear. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. Rhett, you're not doing as badly as you think. If we tighten up the bookkeeping, track expenses better, you could actually make a decent profit. He stared at her, and in that moment, Annie saw something in his face that made her breath catch. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. Respect, maybe. Or recognition. Partners, he said quietly. Partners, she agreed. They stood there in the dusty office as evening light slanted through the window. 2 strangers learning to be something more, and Annie felt the future shift slightly, opening up possibilities she hadn't dared imagine. Later, after a dinner they cooked together and ate in comfortable silence, Annie found herself on the porch watching the sun set. The sky went through every shade of orange and red and purple, a riot of color that took her breath away. Philadelphia had sunsets, but they were muted by smoke and buildings. Here, the sky was everything. Rhett joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He gave her one and leaned against the rail. First full day done, he said. How are you holding up? I'm tired. My back hurts. And I think I inhaled about a pound of dust. Annie sipped her coffee. But I'm all right. Yeah? Yeah. And surprisingly, she meant it. They stood together, not quite touching but aware of each other, watching darkness creep across the land. A coyote yipped in the distance, answered by another. The first stars appeared, bright and sharp. Annie, Rhett said, thank you. For what? For trying, for not running, for... He gestured helplessly. For being here. Annie looked up at him, this giant of a man who'd defended her to his community, who'd honored her terms without question, who was learning to be gentle despite everything in his history that taught him otherwise. Thank you for letting me, she said. And in that moment, standing on a rough wooden porch under an endless western sky, Annie Marlowe Boone thought that maybe, just maybe, she'd made the right choice after all. The rhythm of ranch life established itself over the next few days, a pattern of work that started before dawn and ended long after dark. Annie woke each morning to the sound of Rhett moving through the house, trying and failing to be quiet. He still slept in the barn, though neither of them mentioned it. The arrangement hung between them, unspoken but understood. They were building something, but it needed time to take root. By the end of her first week, Annie had transformed the office from disaster zone into functional workspace. She'd created a filing system, updated the ledgers, and discovered that Rhett was owed money from 3 different cattle buyers who'd never paid their final installments. When she showed him the documentation, he'd stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. I forgot about these, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. Lost track after Mama died. There was just so much to do, and the paperwork seemed less important than keeping the animals fed. It's several $100s, Rhett. That's not insignificant. Can you write the letters? I'm no good at that kind of thing. Always sound too rough or too soft, never hit the right tone. So Annie wrote the letters, her penmanship careful, and her language firm but professional. She also started tracking daily expenses, noting every purchase, every sale, every movement of money. It was satisfying work, seeing the chaos resolve into clear numbers that told a story. But the house itself remained largely untouched. The spare bedroom where Annie slept was comfortable enough, but the rest of the place bore the marks of a man living alone. Minimal furniture, nothing decorative, surfaces either completely bare or completely cluttered. The kitchen had what was necessary, and nothing more. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floors, no pictures on the walls. It was a structure, not a home. Annie tried not to let it bother her. She'd come here for security, not comfort. But something in her rebelled against the bleakness, the sense that no one had cared about this space in years. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the wedding, she woke with a plan. Rhett was at the table when she emerged, coffee already made, eggs sizzling on the stove. They'd fallen into this routine. He cooked breakfast, she handled the other meals, and they worked together on everything else. It was efficient, if not exactly comfortable. Morning, he said without turning. Sleep all right? Well enough. Rhett, I need to go into town today. He turned then, spatula in hand, eyebrows raised. Something wrong? No, Annie poured herself coffee, marshaling her thoughts. I need to buy some things. For the house. Fabric for curtains, a few rugs maybe, some basic supplies. And I want to start cleaning out the shop, see what I'm working with. Rhett studied her for a long moment. You planning to spend money? My allowance. From the agreement. Annie lifted her chin, ready to argue if necessary. They hadn't actually implemented that part of their arrangement yet. She'd been living on his generosity, eating his food, using his resources, but Rhett just nodded. Fair enough. Let me finish checking the south fence line, then I'll take you. Should be done by mid-morning. I can take myself. I'm perfectly capable of driving a wagon. I don't doubt it, but the gray mare's been acting up lately, and the bay's temperamental with strangers. Rather, you didn't end up thrown in a ditch your first week here. He said it casually, but Annie heard the concern underneath. Not control exactly, care. She was still learning to distinguish between the two. All right, she said. Thank you. They ate breakfast together, then Rhett disappeared to work on his fence while Annie washed dishes and made a list of what she needed. Fabric for curtains, at least enough for the main room and her bedroom. A few kitchen towels, soap for laundry. Thread, needles, basic sewing supplies. If Clara had fabric remnants, maybe enough to make a quilt eventually. And supplies for the shop. She'd need a broom, rags, vinegar for cleaning windows, oil for the door hinges. The list grew longer as she thought, and Annie found herself getting excited despite her attempts at practicality. When Rhett returned, dusty and sweating, she showed him the list. He whistled low. That's ambitious. Is it too much? I can cut things. No, it's fine. Good, even. Place needs a woman's touch. Always has. He glanced around the sparse main room. I just never knew what to do about it. Hiring someone to decorate seemed foolish, but I don't have an eye for that kind of thing. Well, you have me now. The words came out more intimate than she'd intended, and they both felt it. Rhett's eyes met hers, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, maybe, that this was real, that they were building something beyond a business arrangement. Yeah, he said softly. I do. The ride into town was quiet but not uncomfortable. Annie watched the landscape roll by, noticing details she'd missed before. A cluster of wildflowers stubbornly blooming despite the heat. A hawk circling overhead, riding thermals with effortless grace. The way the grass moved in waves when the wind picked up, like water across an invisible sea. Flatridge looked different today, less threatening somehow. A few people nodded as they passed, and Annie found herself nodding back. She was part of this place now, whether she'd planned it or not. Rhett stopped at the general store first. Clara was helping a customer but waved them toward the fabric section. I'll be with you in a minute. Annie moved through the store, running her hands over bolts of cloth. The selection wasn't extensive. This wasn't Philadelphia, with its specialized shops and imported goods, but there was enough. A sturdy cotton and cream that would make good curtains. Some cheerful yellow fabric that could brighten the kitchen. A few remnants in various patterns that Annie could piece together for a quilt. She was examining a bolt of blue calico when she heard a familiar voice. Well, if it isn't the city bride, slumming it with the common folk today? Annie turned to find Catherine Walsh standing behind her, a basket on her arm and that same poisonous smile on her face. She wore a dress that was entirely too fine for a Thursday afternoon, emerald green silk that must have cost a fortune and been ordered from back east. Mrs. Walsh, Annie said evenly, how nice to see you again. Is it? Catherine moved closer, her perfume heavy and cloying. I've been meaning to call on you, actually. See how you're settling in. It must be quite an adjustment going from civilization to... She waved vaguely. This. I'm adjusting fine, thank you. Are you? Because I heard from Jenny Morris that you haven't been to church yet. Haven't joined the Ladies' Aid Society or attended any of the social gatherings. Some people are saying you think you're too good for us. Annie felt her temper flare but kept her voice calm. I've been here exactly 1 week, Mrs. Walsh. I've been rather busy getting my house in order and learning how to run a ranch. Your house? Catherine's laugh was bright and cruel. Darling, that's Rhett's house. Has been in his family for 30 years. You're just borrowing it temporarily until he realizes his mistake. That's enough, Catherine. Both women turned to find Rhett standing there, his face like thunder. Annie hadn't heard him approach, but he was there now, solid and furious. Catherine's expression shifted, became almost coy. Rhett, darling, I was just welcoming your wife to the community, offering my assistance. That what you call it? His voice was cold. Sounded more like you were being a jealous harpy, same as always. Jealous? Catherine's face flushed. Of what? That you had to send away for a wife because no local woman would have you? That you're stuck with some mouse of a girl who probably can't even ride a horse? I said enough. Rhett stepped between them, his bulk shielding Annie. You want to take shots at me? Fine. I can handle it. But you leave Annie alone. She's done nothing to you except exist, and if you can't be civil, then you can stay the hell away from both of us. Catherine's eyes glittered with something ugly. You'll regret this, Rhett Boone. Marrying some stranger, shutting out the people who've known you your whole life. It won't end well. She swept past them, her skirts rustling, leaving a wake of staring customers and heavy silence. Annie realized she was shaking. Rhett turned to her, his anger melting into concern. You all right? Why does she hate me so much? I've never done anything to her. You exist, and you married me. That's enough. He touched her shoulder gently. Catherine expected I'd eventually come crawling back to her, that she could have both ranches without having to actually marry me. Your arrival ruined that plan. So I made an enemy before I even arrived. You didn't make anything. Catherine makes her own enemies. He glanced around at the watching faces, then raised his voice. Anyone else got something to say about my wife? Now's the time, because I won't be this polite next time. The store fell silent. Then Clara emerged from the back, her face set in disapproving lines. Catherine Walsh is a bitter woman who never learned that the world doesn't revolve around her, Clara announced, and anyone who listens to her poison is a fool. Now, Mrs. Boone, let's get you what you came for and ignore the nonsense. The moment broke, and people went back to their business, though Annie could feel eyes on her. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear. Instead, she forced herself to continue shopping, to act like nothing had happened. Clara helped her select fabric, offering advice on what would wear well and what was overpriced. She threw in extra thread and needles, calling it a discount that Annie suspected was actually a gift. Rhett paid without comment, and they loaded everything into the wagon. Now the shop? He asked, and Annie nodded, grateful he wasn't suggesting they go home. The dress shop looked even worse in full daylight, but Annie tried to see past the neglect to what it could be. Rhett produced a key. Apparently Clara had been holding on to it for years. And the door opened with a groan of protesting hinges. Inside, dust lay thick on everything. The floorboards were solid but needed sanding. The windows were intact but filthy. Shelves lined 2 walls, and a long counter dominated the front of the space. In the corner, Sarah Miller's dress form stood like a ghost, draped in faded fabric. But underneath the neglect, Annie could see the bones of something good. The space was well proportioned, with high ceilings and good light. There was a small back room that could serve as a workspace and a tiny closet that might hold supplies. "What do you think?" Rhett asked, watching her face. "I think it's perfect," Annie said honestly. "It'll take work, but I can make it beautiful again." "You sound sure of that." "I am." She ran her hand along the counter, leaving a track in the dust. "My aunt loved this place. I can feel it. She'd want it restored, want it living again." Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if I helped? Not with the woman's work, the sewing and designing and all that, but with the repairs, the building itself." Annie turned to look at him, surprised. "You'd do that?" "Why not? I'm handy with tools and you're my wife. Your success is my success, right? That's what partners means." Something warm bloomed in Annie's chest, unfamiliar and slightly frightening. "That would be... Thank you. That would be wonderful." They spent the next hour taking stock of what needed to be done. The list was daunting. Windows cleaned, floors refinished, walls repainted, door fixed, shelves repaired, a new sign made. But it was also exciting. This was hers, truly hers, and she was going to make it work. When they finally left, the sun was past its zenith and Annie was exhausted. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from purpose rather than mere survival. On the ride home, Rhett said, "About Catherine. I don't want to talk about her. I know, but I need to say this." He kept his eyes on the road. "She's going to keep causing trouble. She's got influence in town, friends who listen to her. Things might get harder before they get easier. I can handle it." "I know you can. I just want you to know that I'm in your corner. Whatever happens, whatever she says or does, I've got your back." Annie looked at him, this man who'd been a stranger 2 weeks ago, who was slowly becoming something more. "Why?" "Why what?" "Why do you care? I'm just a mail-order bride, like Catherine said. You could have married anyone, someone local who knew this life. Why fight for me?" Rhett was silent for so long that Annie thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Because you're the first person in years who's treated me like I'm worth something beyond my land or my size. Because you look at me and see a partner, not a monster or a meal ticket. And because..." He paused. "Because I'm starting to think I'm damn lucky you answered that advertisement." Annie's breath caught. She didn't know what to say to that, so she reached over and touched his arm, just briefly. He glanced at her, surprised, and she saw something in his face that made her heart beat faster. They were building something, she realized. Slowly, carefully, like the foundation of a house. It wasn't love, not yet, maybe not ever, but it was respect, trust, partnership. It was enough. When they reached the ranch, Rhett helped her unload the supplies. Annie immediately set to work, measuring windows for curtains while Rhett went to tend the animals. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity, cutting fabric, hemming edges, the repetitive motion of needle through cloth soothing in its familiarity. By evening, she had curtains for the kitchen windows. They weren't fancy, but they softened the harsh angles of the room, made it feel less like a functional space and more like a place where people lived. Rhett stopped in the doorway when he saw them, and his face did something complicated. "Looks nice," he said gruffly. "Real nice." They cooked dinner together. It was becoming their routine, a shared task that required coordination and created something neither could make alone. Tonight it was stew, using beef Rhett had butchered and vegetables from his small garden. Annie added herbs she'd noticed growing wild by the creek, and the result was better than either expected. As they ate, Rhett said, "I was thinking, dangerous habit." He smiled at that. "Probably, but I was thinking about sleeping arrangements." Annie's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Oh?" "Not like that," he said quickly, his face reddening. "I mean, I've been sleeping in the barn for over a week now, and while it's not terrible, it's not great either. And this is my house, has been for years. Seems foolish to make myself uncomfortable when there's a perfectly good room I built myself going unused." "You want your room back?" "I want my room back," he confirmed, "but I don't want you to feel uncomfortable or pressured. So I thought maybe you could move into the bigger bedroom, the one I've been using. It's got more space, better windows, a bigger bed. And I'll take the smaller room, the one you've been in." Annie considered this. The room she currently occupied was indeed smaller, but it was also farther from the main living areas. Having Rhett in the house at night would change things, make their marriage feel more real. But she was tired of tiptoeing around reality. They were married. They lived together. They worked together. Pretending otherwise was just delaying the inevitable. "All right," she said. "That makes sense." Rhett looked relieved. "Yeah? You're sure?" "I'm sure. We're both adults, Rhett. We can share a house without it being strange." "Right. Of course." He attacked his stew with renewed vigor. "I'll move my things tonight after dinner. Won't take long." But it did take a while because Rhett had more possessions than Annie expected. Books, mostly, which surprised her. She'd assumed he wasn't much of a reader, but his shelf held volumes on animal husbandry, ranching techniques, even some fiction. There was a battered copy of Ivanhoe, the spine cracked from multiple readings. "You like Walter Scott?" she asked, picking it up. "My mother did. Read it to me when I was young, before things got real bad. I kept it after she died, read it sometimes when I need to remember she existed before all the pain." Annie set the book down carefully, feeling like she'd touched something sacred. "I'd like to hear about her sometime. Your mother." "Not much to tell. She was kind, patient, everything my father wasn't. She loved books and music and growing things. This place broke her, slowly, year by year. By the time she died, there wasn't much left of the woman she'd been." He picked up the book, running his thumb over the cover. "But she was good, Annie. Despite everything, she stayed good. I try to remember that." They finished moving his things in silence, weighted with shared understanding. Annie settled into the larger bedroom, which still smelled faintly of leather and tobacco. It felt strange sleeping in Rhett's bed, surrounded by his things, but also oddly intimate, a glimpse into the man he was when no one was watching. That night, lying in the darkness, Annie heard him moving through the house, his footsteps heavy on the floorboards. The house itself seemed to exhale, relaxing into a new arrangement. She heard him settle in the small bedroom, the creak of the bed frame under his weight. They were separated by a single wall now, close enough that she could hear him breathing if she listened carefully. Close enough that the distance between them felt both protective and fragile. Annie closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept circling back to the day's events. Catherine's venom. Rhett's defense. The dress shop waiting to be restored. The curtains brightening the kitchen. The way Rhett had said he was lucky she'd answered his advertisement. She'd come west for survival, for practicality, for her sister's medical bills and her own desperate need for security. She hadn't expected kindness, hadn't expected respect or partnership, or the slow, careful building of something that might eventually become friendship, might eventually become more. The thought terrified her, so she pushed it away and focused on sleep. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more small steps toward whatever future they were building together. The next morning brought rain, the first since Annie's arrival. It came suddenly, heavy drops that hammered on the roof and turned the yard into a quagmire. Rhett stood at the window, coffee cup in hand, watching it come down. "Needed this," he said. "Ground's been too dry. This'll help the grass, make the cattle happy." Annie joined him, watching water pour from the eaves. In Philadelphia, rain had been an inconvenience, something that made the streets muddy and the tenements smell worse. Here, it felt like a blessing. "What do you do on rain days?" she asked. "Inside work, mostly. Mend tack, sharpen tools, work on equipment. Why?" "Because I thought maybe you could start on the dress shop. The repairs don't all need to be done outside, and it would give you something productive to do instead of sitting here going stir-crazy." He looked at her, amused. "You think you know me well enough to predict cabin fever?" "I think I'm learning," Annie smiled. "Besides, I saw how you looked when the rain started, like a prisoner seeing his cell door close." Rhett laughed. "Fair enough. All right, let's go look at your shop, see what I can tackle today." They drove to town through the rain, which had settled into a steady downpour. The streets were empty, most people sensibly staying indoors. The dress shop looked even more forlorn in the gray light, water dripping through a crack in the eaves. Inside, Rhett made a circuit of the space, testing floorboards, examining window frames, poking at walls. Annie swept while he worked, pushing years of accumulated dust into piles. "Windows need resealing," Rhett said finally, "and there's some water damage up there." He pointed to a discolored patch on the ceiling. "Roof probably needs patching, but the bones are solid. Your aunt built well." She learned from her father. He was a carpenter back east. They worked together through the morning, Rhett starting repairs while Annie cleaned. The repetitive motion was meditative, and Annie found herself relaxing into the rhythm. Outside, rain continued to fall, and inside, the space slowly transformed. Around noon, Clara appeared at the door, shaking water from an enormous umbrella. "Thought I might find you here," she said. "Brought lunch, since I figured neither of you would think to eat." She produced a basket containing sandwiches, apples, and a jar of lemonade. They ate sitting on the floor since there were no chairs yet, and Annie found herself laughing at something Rhett said, a story about a horse that had once broken into the house and eaten an entire loaf of bread before anyone noticed. Clara watched them with knowing eyes. "You two are settling in well." "We're trying," Annie said. "Trying's good. Trying means you give a damn." Clara bit into an apple, chewed thoughtfully. "You know what I like about you two? You're honest. No pretense that this is some grand romance, just two people making an effort, building something real." "Is that unusual?" Annie asked. "More than you'd think. Most couples around here, they married because they had to or because it was expected. They make it work, mostly, but there's not much joy in it. You two, though," she waved her apple for emphasis, "you might actually end up liking each other." After Clara left, they continued working. Rhett showed Annie how to seal windows properly, and she helped him measure for new shelf supports. The afternoon passed quickly, and when they finally returned home, both were exhausted but satisfied. That night, Annie worked on the kitchen curtains while Rhett sat at the table, laboriously writing letters to the cattle buyers who owed him money. She'd drafted the text, but he wanted to copy them in his own hand, make them more personal. "How do you spell appreciate?" he asked. Annie spelled it out, watching him form each letter with painful care. His handwriting was rough but legible, the script of someone who taught himself late and never quite mastered the elegance of formal education. "You write well," she said. "Better than you think." "I can read better than I write. Mama taught me young, before things got bad. But writing," he shook his head, "always feels like I'm moving through mud. Practice helps. So does having someone patient enough to spell things." He glanced up, smiling slightly. "Thank you, by the way, for all of this. The letters, the books, making sense of my disaster of an office. I know it's not exciting work. It's necessary work, and I'm good at it, which makes it satisfying." Annie tied off a thread, examining her stitching. Besides, you're helping with my shop. Fair's fair." They worked in comfortable silence until late, the rain continuing to drum on the roof, and Annie thought about Clara's words, about building something real, about the possibility of actually liking each other. She glanced at Rhett, bent over his letters, his face set in concentration, and realized with a start that she already did like him, respected him, maybe even trusted him, which was more than she'd trusted anyone in years. It was a dangerous feeling, that trust. It made her vulnerable in ways she'd sworn never to be again. But it was also liberating, like setting down a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. When they finally said goodnight and retreated to their separate rooms, Annie lay in the darkness, listening to Rhett settle into sleep. The rain had softened to a whisper, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang its lonely song. Annie closed her eyes and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like if this arrangement became something more. If partnership became friendship, and friendship became love. If the careful distance they maintained dissolved into something warmer, more intimate. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt almost like hope. The confrontation came on a Saturday, 3 weeks after the wedding, when Annie least expected it. She'd been working in the dress shop all morning, scrubbing years of grime from the windows while Rhett repaired the shelving in the back room. The space was starting to look presentable. Floors sanded and oiled, walls freshly whitewashed, windows clear enough to let in proper light. Annie had even found her aunt's old sewing machine in the back closet, buried under moth-eaten fabric. With some oil and patience, she'd gotten it working again, and the familiar whir of the treadle made her feel closer to Sarah Miller, to the woman who'd loved this place enough to build something from nothing. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm over the past weeks, she and Rhett. Morning chores, breakfast together, work on their separate projects, lunch, more work, dinner, and evenings spent in companionable silence, her sewing while he read or worked on ranch paperwork. It wasn't romantic, but it was comfortable, and comfort felt like a luxury Annie had never been able to afford before. She was on a ladder, hanging new curtains she'd made from cheerful yellow fabric, when the door opened. Annie turned, expecting Clara with her usual offering of gossip and baked goods. Instead, Catherine Walsh stood in the doorway, looking around the shop with undisguised disdain. My, Catherine said, her voice dripping false sweetness. "You've been busy, haven't you? Almost makes it look like a real shop instead of the sad little hobby it actually is." Annie climbed down from the ladder carefully, refusing to be rushed or intimidated. "Mrs. Walsh, what can I do for you?" "Oh, I'm not here to buy anything. I just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. People in town can't stop talking about poor little Annie Boone and her quaint dress shop." Catherine ran a gloved finger along the counter, checking for dust. "I wonder if they'll still be talking once they realize you can't actually sew worth a damn." "I can sew perfectly well, thank you." "Can you?" "Because I heard from Emma Peterson that her mother used to take her sewing to Sarah Miller, and Sarah was an artist. You're just a factory girl playing pretend." The words hit harder than Annie wanted to admit. She'd been worried about the same thing, that her mill work, repetitive and industrial, hadn't prepared her for the delicate custom work that dressmaking required. But she'd been practicing every evening, relearning techniques her aunt had taught her years ago, and her stitches were getting cleaner, more even. "What do you want, Catherine?" Annie asked, too tired for games. Catherine's smile sharpened. "I want you to understand something. This town was mine before you arrived. The women here, they look to me for guidance, for fashion advice, for connections to the wider world. And I'm not about to let some nobody from Philadelphia waltz in and disrupt the natural order. I'm not trying to disrupt anything. I'm just trying to run a business. A business that will fail spectacularly, I imagine. Who's going to buy dresses from you when they can order from my catalogs? I have connections in Chicago, New York, San Francisco. I can get them the latest fashions, real quality, not whatever amateur hour nonsense you're planning to peddle." Annie felt her temper rising but forced it down. "Then you have nothing to worry about, do you? If I'm going to fail anyway, why are you here?" Catherine stepped closer, and Annie caught the scent of that cloying perfume again. "Because I want to make sure you understand your place. You're Rhett Boone's charity case, nothing more. A purchased wife who will last maybe a year before the reality of this life breaks you, and you run back east where you belong." "That's enough." Both women turned. Rhett filled the doorway, and his face was terrible in its coldness. Annie had never seen him look like that. Not angry, exactly, but something more dangerous. Controlled fury. "I thought I told you to stay away from my wife," he said, his voice low and even. Catherine laughed, but it sounded forced. "Oh, Rhett, don't be dramatic. Annie and I were just having a friendly chat, weren't we, Annie?" "Get out," Rhett said. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Get out of this shop and don't come back. Not here, not to our ranch, not anywhere near Annie. Are we clear?" Catherine's face flushed red. "You can't speak to me like that. My family—" "Your family's ranch borders mine, and I've been patient with you out of respect for that. But my patience is done." He stepped fully into the shop, and suddenly the space felt smaller. "You've made your feelings clear, Catherine. You're angry I didn't marry you, angry I chose someone else, angry the world didn't arrange itself according to your plans. Fine. Be angry. But you don't get to take it out on Annie." "She's nothing," Catherine spat. "A nobody who answered an advertisement because she couldn't find a husband the normal way." "And what does that make you?" Rhett's voice was quiet, almost gentle, which made his words cut deeper. "A woman who had a husband and drove him to spend more time with his horses than his wife. A woman so bitter and cruel that I'd have shot myself before marrying you, even if Annie had never existed?" The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine's face went from red to white, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Annie almost felt sorry for her. Almost, but not quite. "You'll regret this," Catherine whispered. "Both of you. This town will turn on you so fast." "Then let it turn." Rhett moved to Annie's side, and his hand found hers, warm and solid. "I've got everything I need right here." Catherine looked between them, something ugly and defeated in her expression. Then she swept from the shop, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows Annie had just cleaned. The moment she was gone, Rhett's hand tightened on Annie's. "Are you all right?" Annie realized she was shaking. "I'm fine. She's poison, and I'm sorry you had to deal with that." He turned to face her fully. "Did she threaten you before I got here?" "Not exactly. She just wanted to make sure I knew my place." "Your place is wherever you damn well choose it to be," Rhett said fiercely. "You're not a charity case, Annie. You're my wife, my partner, and you're worth 10 of Catherine Walsh on her best day." The words, simple and honest, made Annie's throat tighten. She'd been holding herself together through Catherine's venom, but Rhett's kindness threatened to undo her completely. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me for basic decency." He released her hand, running his own through his hair in frustration. "I should have dealt with Catherine weeks ago. Should have made it clear that she can't—" He broke off, shaking his head. "But I kept thinking if I ignored it, she'd get bored and move on. I was wrong." "You defended me," Annie said, both times now. "That's more than most husbands would do." "Most husbands are fools." He looked at her intently. "Annie, I meant what I said out there, about having everything I need. I know this started as a business arrangement, but you've become—" He struggled for words. "You've become important to me. As a partner, as a friend, and I won't stand by while someone tries to hurt you." Annie's heart hammered against her ribs. They were standing close now, closer than they usually allowed themselves. She could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, the small scar on his chin that she'd never noticed before. "You've become important to me too," she said quietly. Something shifted in Rhett's expression, hope, maybe, or fear, or some complicated mixture of both. He started to say something, then stopped, and Annie saw him physically pull back, rebuild the careful distance they'd maintained. "I should finish those shelves," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Let you get back to your curtains." He disappeared into the back room, and Annie returned to her ladder, but her hands were unsteady, and her mind kept replaying the moment, the way he'd held her hand, the way he'd looked at her, the words he'd almost said. They worked the rest of the afternoon in near silence, the easy companionship of earlier replaced by something charged and uncertain. Annie couldn't stop thinking about Catherine's words, that she was nothing, a charity case, a purchased wife. The rational part of her knew it wasn't true, but old insecurities had deep roots. What if she couldn't make the shop work? What if her sewing wasn't good enough? What if she really was just playing pretend, and everyone could see it except her? By the time they closed up and headed home, Dark clouds were building on the horizon. The air felt heavy, pregnant with the promise of a storm. Rhett drove the wagon in silence, his jaw tight, clearly still angry about Catherine's visit. "She was right about one thing," Annie said finally. "What?" "I don't have my aunt's skill. I'm adequate at sewing, but Sarah Miller was an artist. Everyone says so. What if I can't live up to that? What if I open the shop and no one comes, or they come once and realize I'm not good enough?" Rhett pulled the wagon to a stop, right there in the middle of the road. He turned to face her fully. "Listen to me," he said. "You're not your aunt, and that's fine. You're Annie Boone, and you've got your own skills, your own strengths. Maybe your stitches aren't as fancy as Sarah's were, but you've got something she didn't." "What?" "Fire, determination, the guts to start over in a place that's not always welcoming." He reached out, hesitated, then tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so gentle, it made Annie's breath catch. "You survived Philadelphia. You survived a factory that chews people up and spits them out. You survived marrying a stranger and moving halfway across the country. You'll survive this too." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've been watching you these past weeks. The way you tackled my disaster of an office, the way you handle the house, the way you don't back down when challenged. You're stronger than you think, Annie. Stronger than most people I know." Thunder rumbled in the distance. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and warm. "We should get home," Annie said, because she didn't know what else to say, because the intensity in Rhett's gaze was too much to hold. He nodded and got the wagon moving again. By the time they reached the ranch, the storm had arrived in earnest. Rain poured from the sky and lightning split the darkness. They ran for the house, both soaked before they'd crossed half the yard. Inside, dripping on the floor, they looked at each other and started laughing. It was absurd. The whole day, the confrontation, the charged moment in the wagon, and now this, standing in puddles of their own making. "I'll get towels," Rhett said, still smiling. He disappeared and returned with rough cotton towels that had seen better days. Annie dried her face and hair, but her dress was soaked through. She'd need to change, but suddenly the thought of going to her room, of being alone with her tumbling thoughts, felt unbearable. "I'll make tea," she said instead. "Annie, you're freezing. Go change first." "In a minute." She busied herself with the kettle, with teacups, with anything to keep her hands occupied. Rhett watched her, concerned, then disappeared to change his own wet clothes. When he returned, wearing dry pants and a shirt he hadn't bothered to button fully, Annie forced herself not to stare at the exposed line of his throat, his collarbones. "What Catherine said," Annie began, then stopped. Started again. "About being a purchased wife, about answering the advertisement because I couldn't find a husband normally, it's not true. But it is true. I did answer an advertisement. I am here because you needed a wife and I needed security. That's the foundation of this whole thing." Rhett came closer, took the teacup from her trembling hands and set it down. "Maybe that's how it started, but that's not what it is now." "Then what is it now?" The question hung between them, enormous and terrifying. Outside, thunder cracked so loud it shook the windows. Inside, Annie's heart pounded a rhythm that matched the storm. "I don't know," Rhett said finally, "but I know it matters. You matter, and whatever we're building here, it's real. It's ours. Nobody else gets to define it." Annie looked up at him. This man who'd been a stranger, who'd become a partner, who was slowly becoming something she didn't have words for yet. "I'm scared," she admitted, "of failing, of not being enough, of letting you down." "I'm scared too," he said, "of being too much like my father, of driving you away, of ruining the best thing that's happened to me in years. You're nothing like your father." "How do you know? You never met him." "I know because I've seen you gentle a skittish horse. I've seen you patient with me when I ask the same questions 3 times. I've seen the way you talk about your mother, the way you keep her book like a treasure." Annie's voice gained strength. "Your father was cruel. You're kind. There's a difference." Rhett's eyes were bright, intense. "You see me," he said, almost wondering. "Really see me, not just the size or the reputation or the history. You see who I actually am." "Yes." "And you're not afraid?" "I didn't say that. I said I'm scared. But not of you." Annie took a breath. Rhett, Whatever she was going to say was lost as lightning struck close enough to make them both jump. The lights flickered, and for a moment the house was plunged into darkness. Then they came back, dimmer than before. "Storm's getting bad," Rhett said, though he didn't move away from her. "We should probably—" A tremendous crash cut him off, followed by the sound of splintering wood. They ran to the window and saw that a large branch from the cottonwood tree had broken off, landing across the fence of the nearest corral. Even through the rain, Annie could see the horses spooked, running in panicked circles. "Damn," Rhett said. "I need to calm them down before they hurt themselves or break through the fence." "I'll help." "Annie, you don't have to. I'm helping." They grabbed oilskin coats and ran back into the storm. The wind had picked up, driving the rain sideways. The horses were in a panic, whites of their eyes showing as lightning continued to split the sky. Annie watched Rhett approach them slowly, his voice low and soothing despite the storm's roar. "Easy now, easy. Just a storm, just noise. Nothing's going to hurt you." One of the mares, the gray that was Rhett's favorite, reared up. Her hoof caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Annie's heart stopped as she watched him stagger, but he kept his feet, kept his voice calm. "It's all right, girl. It's all right." Gradually, impossibly, his presence calmed them. The horses stopped running, stopped panicking, and clustered around him like children seeking comfort. Annie stood at the fence, rain plastering her hair to her face, watching in awe as this giant of a man gentled terrified animals with nothing but patience and soft words. This was who he really was, she realized. Not the rough exterior or the hard reputation, but this, someone who calmed fears, who protected the vulnerable, who chose gentleness over force even when force would be easier. When the horses were finally settled in the barn, away from the storm, Rhett and Annie stumbled back to the house. They were both soaked again, muddy now too, exhausted and exhilarated. "That was incredible," Annie said, peeling off the oilskin coat. "The way you handled them." "They were just scared. Needed someone to show them it was going to be all right." "Don't we all?" Annie said quietly. Rhett looked at her, water dripping from his hair, mud on his face, and Annie saw in his expression everything he wasn't saying. All the careful distance they'd maintained, all the lines they'd drawn between partnership and something more. The storm had washed them away, leaving only raw honesty. "Annie," he said, and her name had never sounded like that before. "I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered. "What?" "When I sent for a mail-order bride, I thought I was being practical, solving a problem. I needed help with the ranch, with the house, with the parts of life I couldn't manage alone. I didn't expect—" He broke off, struggling. "I didn't expect to care. To wake up looking forward to breakfast because I'd get to see you. To find excuses to work on your shop because I love watching you create something beautiful. To lie awake at night thinking about you in the next room and wondering what it would be like if—" He stopped, and Annie waited, barely breathing. "If what?" "If this was real," he finished. "Not just an arrangement or a partnership, but a real marriage, with everything that means." The rain pounded on the roof, and somewhere thunder rolled, but Annie barely heard it over the rush of blood in her ears. She should be afraid. She'd learned the hard way not to trust, not to want, not to hope for things that could hurt her. But standing here, dripping and muddy and raw, she found she couldn't lie. "What if I told you it already is real?" she said. "What if I told you I've been lying awake too, thinking the same things?" Rhett went very still. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I came here for practical reasons, but I'm staying for different ones. I'm saying you've become more than a partner to me, more than a friend." Annie took a breath, dove in. "I'm saying I think I could love you, if you'd let me. Maybe I already do." The words hung in the charged air between them. Rhett stared at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language, like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "You could love me," he repeated slowly. "Me. After everything you've heard about my family, about my temper, after seeing who you actually are," Annie corrected. "Not who people say you are or who you're afraid you might be, but who you choose to be every single day." Something broke in Rhett's expression, some last wall of defense crumbling. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides, and his hands came up to frame her face, gentle, despite their size. I don't know how to do this, he said roughly. I don't know how to be a husband, a real one. My only example was terrible, and I'm so afraid I'll get it wrong. I'll hurt you. Then we'll figure it out together, Annie said. That's what partners do, right? He laughed, shaky and disbelieving. You're something else, Annie Boone, you know that? So I've been told. For a long moment they just stood there, foreheads nearly touching, breathing the same air. Annie could feel the heat of him despite their wet clothes, could see the water beating on his eyelashes. This close, he was overwhelming, not because of his size, but because of the intensity of his focus, the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the world. Can I kiss you? He asked, and the question was so careful, so respectful, that Annie felt something in her chest crack open. Yes, she whispered. He moved slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind. When his lips finally met hers, it was gentle, almost tentative, like he was afraid of breaking something precious. Annie's eyes fluttered closed, and she let herself feel the warmth of his mouth, the slight scrape of stubble against her skin, the way his hands trembled slightly where they held her face. The kiss was brief, barely more than a touch, but when they broke apart, everything had changed. Annie could see it in Rhett's eyes, wonder and fear and hope all tangled together. She suspected her own expression mirrored his. So, he said, his voice rough. What now? Annie laughed, giddy and terrified and more alive than she'd felt in years. Now we figure it out, together. The storm raged outside, but inside, something new was being born, something fragile and precious and entirely theirs. They stood in the kitchen, dripping and muddy, and talked until the storm passed and the first light of dawn crept through the windows. They talked about fears and hopes, about the past and the future, about all the small moments that had led them to this point. And when Annie finally went to bed, climbing between sheets in a room that still smelled like Rhett, she found she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the future, not of vulnerability, not even of love. She'd come west looking for survival and found something infinitely more valuable. She'd found a partner, a home, and maybe, just maybe, she'd found herself. Morning came soft and golden, the storm having scrubbed the sky clean. Annie woke to birdsong and the smell of coffee, and for a disoriented moment couldn't remember why her heart felt so light. Then memory flooded back, the storm, the confession, the kiss, and she sat up, pressing her fingers to her lips. It had happened. It was real. She dressed quickly, nervous energy making her fingers clumsy with buttons. When she emerged from the bedroom, Rhett was at the stove, his back to her, and Annie's breath caught at the sight of him. Nothing had changed physically. He was still the same man, large and solid and rough around the edges. But everything felt different now, charged with possibility. He turned when he heard her, and the smile that spread across his face was tentative but genuine. Morning. Morning, she echoed, suddenly shy. I made breakfast. Eggs and bacon, nothing fancy. I thought maybe we could... He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. I thought maybe we should talk. About last night. Make sure we're on the same page. Annie's stomach fluttered with nerves, but she nodded and sat at the table. Rhett brought over 2 plates, then sat across from her, his large frame making the chair look small. I meant what I said, he began, his voice careful. About caring for you. About wanting this to be real. But I also don't want to rush you or make you feel pressured. We can take this slow, figure it out as we go. I'd like that, Annie said. Slow sounds good. Relief washed over his face. Yeah? Yeah. We've built something good these past weeks. I don't want to lose that by moving too fast or expecting too much too soon. She met his eyes. But I also don't want to pretend anymore that this is just business. It stopped being just business a while ago. For me too. Rhett reached across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, Annie put her hand in his. His palm was warm, calloused, completely engulfing hers. So we're doing this? Really trying? We're trying. They ate breakfast holding hands across the table, an awkward arrangement that made cutting bacon nearly impossible, but neither was willing to let go first. It was silly and sweet and so different from the careful distance they'd maintained before. When they finally released each other to clear the dishes, Annie found herself smiling for no reason at all. The day unfolded with a new rhythm. Rhett went to tend the animals while Annie worked in the house, but every so often he'd find an excuse to come back, needing water, checking on something, just passing through. Each time their eyes would meet, and that new awareness would spark between them. Around mid-morning, Clara arrived in her wagon, a basket over her arm and curiosity written all over her face. "Heard there was quite a storm last night," she said, eyes sharp as she studied Annie. "Everyone all right out here?" "We're fine. Lost a tree branch, but no real damage." "Mm-hmm." Clara set her basket down, full of fresh bread and preserves. "And how are things otherwise? You look different somehow." Annie felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Clara's smile was knowing. "Well, whatever it is, it suits you. You're glowing, girl." Before Annie could respond, Rhett appeared in the doorway, saw Clara, and actually blushed, his face going red from collar to hairline. Clara's eyes went wide with delight. "Well, well," she said, "something did happen last night." "Clara," Rhett said warningly. "Oh, don't worry, I'm not going to pry." "Much," she grinned. "I'm just happy to see two people finally admitting what everyone else could see weeks ago." "What do you mean, what everyone could see?" Annie asked. "Dear child, the way you two look at each other when you think no one's watching, the way Rhett goes out of his way to defend you, the way you light up when he walks in a room." Clara shook her head. "Blind man could see you were falling for each other. You were just the last to figure it out." After Clara left, with promises to keep their business private and threats of violence if Rhett messed things up, Annie and Rhett found themselves alone again, both slightly embarrassed, but also oddly reassured. If Clara had seen it, maybe it really was real. Maybe they weren't making it up or rushing into something foolish. "Want to work on the shop today?" Rhett asked. "I could finish those shelves, and you mentioned wanting to organize your aunt's old supplies." "I'd like that." They drove to town together, and Annie noticed how different it felt sitting beside him now. Before, she'd been hyper-aware of maintaining space between them. Now she let herself lean slightly in his direction, let their shoulders brush with the wagon's movement, and felt a quiet thrill each time they touched. The dress shop was coming along beautifully. The repairs were nearly done, the space clean and bright, and Annie's vision for what it could be was starting to materialize. She spent the afternoon sorting through her aunt's old supplies, bolts of fabric, spools of thread, patterns carefully preserved in tissue paper, and a collection of fashion plates that showed styles from a decade ago. "Look at this," she said, holding up a pattern for an elaborate day dress with leg of mutton sleeves and intricate pleating. "This was fashionable when my aunt first opened. Imagine wearing this in the summer heat here." Rhett looked up from where he was installing the last shelf bracket. "Seems impractical." "Fashion often is." Annie set the pattern aside carefully. "I think I want to do something different, not just copying old patterns, but adapting them for this place, this climate. Dresses that are beautiful, but also functional, something women can actually wear while living real lives." "That's smart. Practical beauty." He smiled. "Sounds like you." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. Annie found herself working with renewed energy, sorting and planning, her mind filling with ideas. She could do alterations and repairs initially, build a reputation for reliable work, then slowly introduce her own designs, prove she wasn't just trading on her aunt's name. They worked until late afternoon, when the heat drove them outside. They sat on the shop's front steps, sharing water from a canteen, watching Flat Ridge go about its business. A few people passed and nodded greetings, and Annie noticed they seemed friendlier than before, more accepting. "Do you think Catherine really will turn the town against us?" she asked. Rhett was quiet for a moment. "She'll try. But Catherine's influence isn't what she thinks it is. People respect her money and her family's history, but they don't necessarily like her. And most folks around here value hard work over status. They'll judge you by what you do, not what Catherine says." "I hope you're right. Even if I'm not, doesn't matter." He turned to look at her. "We have each other. That's enough." The simple confidence in his voice made Annie's throat tight. She reached over and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just learning that some things are worth fighting for." They sat like that as the sun began its descent, hands linked, shoulders touching, and Annie thought about how far they'd come. A month ago, she'd stepped off a train into an unknown future, terrified and desperate. Now here she sat, holding hands with a man she was learning to love, in a town that was slowly becoming home. That evening, Rhett suggested they go to the creek for dinner, have a picnic instead of eating at the house. Annie packed leftover chicken and bread, some of Clara's preserves, and 2 apples. They walked to the creek as the sky turned pink and gold, and Rhett spread a blanket under the cottonwood trees. The water was low but moving, making soft sounds over the rocks. Grasshoppers sang in the tall grass, and somewhere a meadowlark called its liquid song. They ate slowly, talking about small things, plans for the shop, needed repairs on the barn, whether they should get chickens for fresh eggs. "My mother used to keep chickens," Rhett said, "before things got too hard. She loved them, had names for all of them. My father thought it was ridiculous, naming animals we'd eventually eat." "Did you eat them?" "No, she couldn't bring herself to do it. They all died of old age, one by one, and she mourned each one like a friend." He smiled sadly. "My father was wrong about a lot of things, but he was especially wrong about that. There's nothing ridiculous about loving something, even if it's temporary." Annie leaned against his shoulder, and after a moment his arm came around her, careful and tentative. They sat like that as darkness fell and stars appeared, and Annie felt a contentment she'd never known before. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Rhett said. "Your real life there, not just the hard parts. There must have been good things too." So Annie told him. About her friend Mary from the mill, who could make her laugh even on the worst days. About Sunday mornings when she'd walk to the park and watch families picnic, imagining a life beyond factory walls. About her sister Maggie's smile when Annie would bring home a penny candy, rare and precious. "Do you miss her?" Rhett asked. "Your sister?" "Every day. But she's in good hands now. Mrs. O'Connor from next door checks on her, and with the money I send from my allowance, she can afford better medicine, better food." Annie's voice caught. "I couldn't give her that in Philadelphia. We were drowning there. Here, at least I can help her." "You could bring her here," Rhett said suddenly. "If you want. Once she's strong enough to travel. We've got room, and the dry air might be good for her lungs." Annie pulled back to look at him. "You'd do that? Take in my sick sister? She's your family. That makes her my family too, doesn't it?" He said it like it was obvious, like there was no other possible answer. Annie kissed him then, unable to help herself. It was less tentative than their first kiss, born from gratitude and growing affection and the simple wonder of being seen, being valued. Rhett made a surprise sound, then kissed her back, one hand coming up to cup her face. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Rhett's eyes were bright in the starlight. "We should probably head back," he said, his voice rough. "Probably." But they didn't move immediately, just sat there under the stars, holding each other, letting the night settle around them like a blessing. The next week brought changes, subtle but significant. Rhett moved back into the main bedroom. His bedroom, the one Annie had been using, but now they shared it. Not in the way married couples traditionally did, not yet, but in small intimacies that felt revolutionary. They'd lie on opposite sides of the bed, talking in the darkness until one or both fell asleep. Annie would wake sometimes to find Rhett's hand had found hers in the night, their fingers loosely intertwined. It was chaste and sweet and exactly what they both needed. Time to adjust, to learn each other, to build trust in this new configuration of their relationship. The dress shop officially opened on a Saturday, 1 month after the wedding. Annie had placed a small advertisement in the local paper, and Clara had spread word through her extensive network. Annie spent the morning arranging and rearranging the shop, nervous energy making her hands shake. "What if no one comes?" she asked Rhett, who was helping her position the dress form in the window. "Then we'll try again next week, and the week after that." "You don't give up easy, Annie. That's one of the things I love about you." The casual use of the word love made her heart skip, but before she could respond, the bell over the door jangled. A woman Annie didn't recognize entered, followed by 2 more. Then Clara arrived with 3 friends. Within an hour, the shop was full of women examining fabrics, discussing alterations, and placing orders. Annie moved through the crowd in a daze, taking measurements, discussing styles, writing down names and deadlines. She'd brought her portfolio, sketches of her own designs, adaptations that would work for ranch life. and women clustered around it with genuine interest. "This is lovely," one woman said, pointing to a day dress with a simplified bodice and practical pockets. "Could you make this in brown cotton, something I could actually wear while working?" "Of course. That's exactly what I'm hoping to do. Make dresses that are beautiful but functional." By the time the crowd thinned, Annie had a dozen orders, ranging from simple repairs to complete custom dresses. She stood at her counter, looking at the list of names and feeling something very close to joy. Red appeared in the doorway, having made himself scarce during the female invasion. "How'd it go?" "I have 12 orders," Annie said, her voice wondering. 12, Rhett, and 3 women asked about making dresses for their daughters, and Mrs. Patterson wants an entire traveling outfit made before Christmas. He crossed the shop and caught her up in a hug, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. Annie laughed, giddy with success and relief and the simple pleasure of being held by him. "Knew you could do it," he said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "You're going to put Catherine's catalog business to shame." As if summoned by her name, Catherine Walsh appeared at the shop door. She looked around, taking in the evidence of Annie's successful opening, the disturbed fabrics, the measurement notes, the clear signs that people had been here, had chosen Annie's services over hers. "Congratulations," Catherine said, and for once her voice held no obvious venom. She actually sounded tired. "I underestimated you." Annie straightened, ready for whatever attack was coming. "Did you come to cause trouble, Mrs. Walsh?" "No." Catherine stepped fully into the shop, and Annie saw the circles under her eyes, the new lines around her mouth. "I came to apologize." The silence was absolute. Rhett's arms tightened protectively around Annie, but she gently disentangled herself and moved toward Catherine. "I don't understand. I've been—" Catherine paused, seeming to struggle for words. "I've been cruel to you since you arrived, unkind and petty, and everything my mother taught me not to be. And I'm sorry." "What changed?" Annie asked carefully, sensing this wasn't a trick, but not quite able to believe it. "I had a long conversation with Clara Hendricks. She has a way of making a person see themselves clearly, and what I saw wasn't pretty." Catherine's hands twisted together. "I've been so angry for so long, at Tom for dying and leaving me alone, at Rhett for not wanting me, at myself for becoming bitter. And when you arrived, young and hopeful and everything I used to be, I hated you for it." Annie didn't know what to say. She'd expected many things from Catherine Walsh, but not this raw honesty. "I'm not asking for friendship," Catherine continued. "I know I burned that bridge before we even met, but I am asking if we could at least coexist peacefully. I'll stop spreading gossip. I'll stop trying to undermine your business. And maybe, if you're extraordinarily generous, you might eventually forgive me for being such a complete witch." Annie looked at Rhett, who shrugged slightly. The decision was hers. She thought about all the things Catherine had said and done, the hurt and embarrassment she'd caused. But she also thought about mercy, about second chances, about how hard it must have been for proud Catherine Walsh to walk in here and apologize. "I can't promise friendship," Annie said slowly, "but I can promise to stop expecting the worst from you. That's a start, isn't it?" Catherine's eyes went bright with unshed tears. "That's more than I deserve." "Thank you." She left quickly after that, and Annie stood in the middle of her shop, trying to process what had just happened. "Well," Rhett said, "that was unexpected. Clara must have really lit into her. Remind me never to get on Clara's bad side." They closed up the shop as evening fell, both exhausted but happy. On the ride home, Annie leaned against Rhett's shoulder, and his arm came around her naturally, like they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For believing in me. For defending me. For helping me build something that's mine." She tilted her head to look up at him. "For being exactly who you are." Rhett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." Annie's stomach clenched at his serious tone. "What?" "I'm falling in love with you, Annie. Maybe I already have fallen. I don't know how it happened or when exactly, but somewhere between organizing papers and hanging curtains and learning to make breakfast together, you became the most important person in my life." He kept his eyes on the road, but his arm tightened around her. "And it terrifies me, because I don't know how to do this right. But I wanted you to know. You deserve to know. Annie felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears. Happy tears. I'm falling in love with you too, she whispered. I think I have been for a while now. I just didn't know what to call it. Yeah. She laughed wetly. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Two broken people learning to be whole together. I like to think we're not broken, just bent a little, and we're straightening each other out. They drove on through the gathering dark, and Annie thought about everything that had led to this moment. The desperation that had driven her to answer an advertisement, the fear that had nearly kept her from getting on the train, the uncertainty of those first days when everything felt foreign and frightening, and now this. Love growing in unexpected soil, partnership deepening into something richer, a future opening up that looked nothing like what she'd imagined but was somehow better. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new pattern. Annie spent mornings working on dress orders, her sewing machine whirring steadily in the shop while Rhett handled ranch business. Afternoons, they'd work together, him on repairs, her on bookkeeping or inventory. Evenings were theirs, spent cooking dinner, reading aloud to each other, or simply sitting on the porch watching the sunset. The physical aspect of their relationship progressed slowly, carefully. Kisses became more frequent, more assured. Rhett learned that Annie liked when he played with her hair. Annie discovered that Rhett's neck was particularly sensitive to kisses. They explored each other's boundaries with patient attention, never pushing, always communicating. One night, nearly 2 months after the wedding, they made love for the first time. It was awkward and tender and not quite what either had expected, but it was theirs. Afterward, they lay tangled together, laughing at their fumbling attempts, and Rhett said, "We'll get better at this with practice." "Is that a promise?" Annie asked, tracing patterns on his chest. "That's a guarantee." And they did get better, growing more comfortable with each other's bodies, learning the language of touch and response. But what mattered more than the physical connection was the emotional intimacy they built, the way they could talk about anything, the way they trusted each other with their fears and hopes, the way they'd become essential to each other. Annie's dress shop thrived. Word spread about her practical, beautiful designs, and women came from neighboring towns to commission work. She hired her first assistant, Emma Peterson's daughter Ruth, who was quick with a needle and eager to learn. The money Annie earned went back into the business at first, buying better equipment and more inventory, but soon she was contributing to the household finances, proving that partnership went both ways. Rhett's ranch prospered too, benefiting from Annie's organizational skills and careful bookkeeping. They paid off the last of his father's debts and began planning improvements. A new barn, better fencing, maybe even hiring regular help instead of just seasonal workers. In November, a letter arrived from Philadelphia. Annie's hands shook as she opened it, fearing bad news about Maggie. Instead, she found that her sister's health had improved dramatically with the better nutrition and medicine Annie's money provided. Maggie wrote in her careful script that the doctor said she might be well enough to travel by spring. She could come here, Annie said, showing Rhett the letter. She could actually come here. Then we'll make a place for her, Rhett said simply. Add a room onto the house. Make it nice. Family takes care of family. Annie kissed him for that, deep and grateful, and that night she wrote back to Maggie with an invitation and enough money for train fare. Christmas came, and with it a party at the ranch. It was Clara's idea, a gathering to celebrate Annie and Rhett's first months together and to welcome Annie properly into the community. People came from all over, bringing food and gifts and good wishes. Catherine Walsh came too, hesitantly, bearing a beautifully wrapped package. Inside was a bolt of silk, expensive and lovely, and a note that read simply, "For your next creation, with respect, Catherine." Annie found her later in the evening, standing alone by the window. "Thank you for the silk. It's beautiful." "You're welcome." "And Annie? I meant what I said about the apology. I've been watching you these past months, and I see now what Rhett saw. You're good for him. Good for this place." They weren't friends, might never be friends, but they weren't enemies anymore either. It was enough. As the party wound down and guests departed, Annie stood on the porch with Rhett, watching wagon lights disappear into the darkness. Snow had started falling, rare for this part of Texas, dusting the world in white. "Happy?" Rhett asked, his arm around her. "Deliriously," Annie said. "Terrifyingly. Sometimes I wake up afraid this is all a dream. Not a dream, just life. Our life. He pulled her closer. You know what I realized today? What? Size really isn't everything. He smiled at his own callback to that first night. Everyone thought I needed someone big and strong to match me. But what I needed was someone with a big heart, strong will, and the courage to take a chance on a broken man with a rough reputation. You're not broken, Annie said fiercely. You're just real, flawed and trying and doing your best like everyone else. Like you? Like me? She turned in his arms to face him fully. I came here desperate and scared, planning to survive long enough to help my sister and maybe carve out some small space for myself. But I found something I didn't know I was looking for. What's that? Home. Not just a place, but a feeling. A person. You, Rhett. You're my home. He kissed her then, deep and slow, and Annie felt snowflakes melting on her face, felt the warmth of him against the cold, felt the absolute rightness of this moment. They'd both been trembling that first night, him with the weight of expectations and fear of his own nature, her with the terror of the unknown. But they'd found their footing together, built something stable on a foundation of honesty and respect. The dress shop stood in town, windows glowing warmly, a testament to Annie's courage and skill. The ranch spread out around them, healthy and thriving, proof of Rhett's dedication and hard work. And between them, growing stronger every day, was something neither had dared hope for. Love, real and earned and absolutely true. Spring would bring Maggie. Summer would bring new challenges, drought or storms or whatever the land decided to throw at them. But they'd face it together, these two people who'd been strangers and became partners and finally became something more. Annie looked up at Rhett, at this man who'd been called a monster and was actually just painfully, beautifully human, and said, I love you. Not despite your size or your past or your scars, but because of all of it, because it made you who you are, and who you are is exactly who I need. I love you too, Rhett said, his voice rough with emotion. My brave, impossible, perfect wife. My Annie. They stood together on the porch of their home, snow falling gently around them, and Annie thought about that question from their wedding night. Size isn't everything, is it? No, she'd learned, it wasn't about physical stature or matching expectations or fitting into predetermined roles. It was about showing up, standing your ground, choosing gentleness over cruelty, offering trust even when fear said to run, building something real from honest foundations. It was about two trembling people finding courage in each other, finding strength in partnership, finding love in the most unexpected places. The cowboy and his bride, no longer trembling, no longer uncertain, walked into their house hand in hand. Behind them, the snow continued to fall, covering the harsh land in softness, promising that even in the hardest places, beautiful things could grow. And inside, in the warmth of their home, they began the next chapter of their story, not with fear or doubt, but with love and hope and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, they'd face it together. Because that's what partners did. That's what love meant. And in the end, that was everything.